So as we were doing your chapter number 4 or 5, this is your chapter number 5 of your syllabus of Edexcel IGCSE Chemistry. And we did the basics of periodic table yesterday. Just kind of we discussed about periods, groups, how are the elements arranged, that you know that they are arranged according to the atomic number. How do we write the scientific notation of elements? How do we determine a number of shells? How do we determine the valence electrons? Now the term valence meant the number of electrons in the most outermost shell. साथ ही when we talk about electronic configurations, now electronic configurations are also related to the periodic table, because by looking at the periodic table you can tell about the electronic configuration, because you know the number of valence electrons by looking at the groups, which are the vertical columns. You also know the number of shells of an element by looking at its period number, which are the horizontal rows. So let's start with the part 2 of periodic table, which is electronic configurations. Deducing electronic configurations. Now we can represent the electronic structure of atoms using electron shell diagrams. We know that electrons orbit the nucleus in shells, and each shell has a different amount of energy associated with it. Now shells are also known as energy levels. First shell का ज़्यादा energy level होगा, फिर जैसे जैसे shells दूर जाते जाएंगे उनका energy level भी increase होता जाता है. Now we can represent the electronic structure of atoms using electron shell diagrams. Electron shell diagrams क्या होती हैं? Let me draw one. Like in between you have a nucleus. You have a nucleus in between which contains protons and neutrons, as we know. Then you have these orbits known as shells or energy levels. ये सारे energy level हैं. First energy level, second energy level, ठीक है? Where the electrons are present. ये वो हैं shells जहाँ पे electrons present होते हैं. Whereas the protons and neutrons are present inside the nucleus. और shells में क्या चीज होती है? Electron. We have already done this in atomic structure when we talk about the subatomic particles. We know that electrons orbit the nucleus in shells. Now you can see that they are orbiting around the nucleus, and each shell has a different amount of energy associated with it. Now her shell की different energy होगी. A first shell is having a different energy than the second shell. So the further away from the nucleus, the more energy a shell has. Now if you look at the same diagram over here, तो आप दोनों shells को देखें. इसका distance from the nucleus is this much, and इसका distance from the nucleus is much more. So obviously the rule is that the further away from the nucleus, the more energy a shell has. So obviously if this is your shell number 1 and this is your shell number 2, obviously your shell number 2 would have greater energy and your shell number 1 would have less energy. So all you have to do is remember one thing, that further the shell is away from the nucleus, obviously it would be having more energy. For example, if an atom has 3 shells, the third shell would be having the most energy, then 2, and then 1 would be having the least. So electrons first occupy the shell closest to the nucleus. जब भी हम electrons fill करना शुरू करते हैं, electronic filling rule, ठीक है, उसके अंदर क्या होता है? Electrons would always first occupy the shell closest to the nucleus. Now the shell closest to the nucleus is your shell number 1, and shell number 1 can hold a maximum of 2 electrons. Next comes shell number 2. When shell number 1 will become full of 2 electrons, next is your shell number 2, which has a maximum capacity of holding 8 electrons. We also call the first shell K and the second shell L. तो आपके पास K, L, M, N ये 3 shells आते हैं, first, second, third, and fourth. And the sequence you're going to remember according to your syllabus is 2, 8, 8, 18. These are the maximum limits given to your first, second, and third and fourth shell. So electrons first occupy the shell closest to the nucleus, which can hold a maximum of 2 electrons. When a shell becomes full of electrons, additional electrons have to be added to the next shell. Now this is the limit I have provided. ठीक है, अब आगे देखते हैं. The second and the third shell can hold 8 electrons each maximum. इनकी जो maximum capacity है of the second and the third shell, that is 8 electrons max. The outermost shell of an atom is called the valence shell, and an atom is much more stable if it can manage to completely fill the shell with electrons. So हमें पता लग गया that the first shell has a maximum capacity of 2 electrons. The second shell has a maximum capacity of 8 electrons, and the third shell has a maximum capacity of 8 electrons as well. So the outermost shell of an atom is called the valence shell. Isliye the term valence, again, valence means outermost. Okay, valence electrons would mean outermost electrons. Valence shell would mean outermost shell. So valence का मतलब ही क्या है basically? Outermost. The term valence means outermost, the last one, the alone one, outermost. So the outermost shell of an atom is called the valence shell, and an atom is much more stable if it can manage to completely fill this shell with electrons. Now we know in most atoms, the outermost shell is not full, and therefore these atoms react with other atoms in order to achieve a full outer shell of electrons, which would make them more stable. बात क्या है, now in most of the atoms जो आपका outermost shell होता है it is not full, ठीक है, therefore these atoms react with other atoms. The outermost shell is only full in group number 8. जो आपके पास group number 8 है, they are known as inert noble gases. Inert meaning they are unreactive and they do not react. How does anything react basically? कोई भी चीज कब react करती है? When it has to form ions, when it needs to gain electrons, when it needs to lose electrons. Now gaining and losing electrons, none of these is one of the properties of your group number 8. ग्रुप नंबर 8 ना ही इलेक्ट्रॉन गेन करता है ना ही इलेक्ट्रॉन लूज करता है. They are inert and unreactive, and that is why their outermost shell is complete. उनका जो outermost shell होता है that is having complete electrons. These atoms react with other atoms in order to achieve a full outer shell. Now the atoms who have not completed their outermost shell, in order to complete their outermost valence shell and in order to complete the number, they have to react with other atoms, and that is why they form compounds so they can fill their outermost electrons and can become neutral, which would make them more stable. Remember one thing, it's also important in your A levels concept as well. वो क्या होता है? When your outermost shell is complete, the atom is known to be stable. When your outermost shell is not complete, it has some leftover electrons, it has some leftover valence electrons that is not complete. Obviously, that atom would be unstable. Or unstable, we also call them radicals. Or in other terms, when they become radioactive, they are also known as radioactive isotopes as well. So in some cases, atoms lose electrons to entirely empty this shell so that the next shell becomes a full outer shell. बहुत से cases आ जाते that atoms start to lose electrons. Why they lose electrons? To empty their shell or to complete their shell. अब वो depend करता है, वो मैं आपको बताऊंगा किस तरह याद करना है. Till now what we have done, that first shell has a maximum capacity of 2 electrons, second shell has the maximum capacity of 8 electrons, and the third shell has a maximum capacity of 8 electrons as well. Now, for example, ये हमने अभी तक देख लिया, each electron shell can accommodate a fixed number of electrons. So we have the first shell, the second shell, and we have the third shell. First shell में हमने देख लिया maximum कितने electrons आ सकते हैं? 2 electrons. Second shell में कितने आ सकते हैं? 8 electrons. And in the third shell, we also have 8 electrons. Now these in front of you are the electronic configurations of the first 20 elements that you have to memorize. ये तो आपको याद होनी चाहिए. First 20 क्योंकि आपके पास हाइड्रोजन से लेके कैल्शियम तक जाते हैं till your period number 1 to 4 के बिल्कुल start तक. इसके बाद आपके period number 1 2 3 4 and all 8 groups are covered. तो इसमें क्या है ना, for example hydrogen has an atomic number of 1, तो इसके electronic configuration भी क्या होगी? 1. Now we know that these are all elements. Elements में क्या होता है? One thing, protons is equal to electrons because these are all atoms. जब भी बात atoms की होती है, protons are always equal to the number of electrons. Helium है. Helium has an atomic number of 2, which means it has 2 electrons and 2 protons. So electronic configuration भी क्या हो जाएगी? 2. Now moving on to the second period. अब second period का क्या मतलब है? It would be having 2 shells. First shell, the second shell. और electronic configuration कैसे होगी? Now the number of electrons in lithium. Lithium का atomic number क्या है? Lithium का atomic number है 3, which means lithium is having 3 protons. And we know that when we talk about atoms, protons are always equal to the number of electrons. So lithium has 3 protons, which means lithium has 3 electrons. तो उसके electronic configuration क्या हो जाएगी? In the first shell, you would have 2 electrons, and in the second shell आप remaining fill कर देंगे. Remaining कितने रह जाएंगे? In total, you had 3 electrons. First shell में maximum कितने आ सकते हैं? Can the first shell occupy all 3 of them? नो इट कांट। फर्स्ट शेल कितने मैक्सिमम ऑक्यूपाई कर सकता है? 2। नाउ लेफ्ट ओवर कितने रह गए हमारे पास? वी आर लेफ्ट विद 1 बिकॉज टोटल आपके पास 3 थे, वी आर लेफ्ट विद 1। तो सेकंड आपके पास सेपरेटली आ जाएगा इन द सेकंड शेल, क्योंकि सेकंड शेल जो आपका है, द सेकंड एनर्जी लेवल जो आपका है, ये आपका सेकंड शेल है, उसकी मैक्सिमम कैपेसिटी तो 8 इलेक्ट्रॉन्स की है। इट कैन होल्ड अनदर 1। तो आपके पास इलेक्ट्रॉनिक कॉन्फ़िगरेशन ऑफ लिथियम हो जाएगी 2 and 1। मोर ओवर आपके पास ऐसे बेरिलियम की है, बोरॉन की है, कार्बन की है, नाइट्रोजन की देख लेते हैं। नाइट्रोजन का एटॉमिक नंबर है 7, which means it has how many electrons? 7 electrons. फर्स्ट शेल में कितने आएंगे? फर्स्ट शेल में आ जाएंगे 2 because first shell always has the maximum capacity of holding 2 electrons. How many more are we left with? अब 7 में से 2 माइनस कर दें तो क्या बनेगा? 7 minus 2 means 5. तो जो remaining 5 है, remaining 5 would be put in your second shell. Same is the case, ऐसे ही आपके पास ऑक्सीजन भी है, फ्लोरीन भी है। Look at neon. Neon को देखिए now, neon has an atomic number of 10. Again, atomic number shows that neon has how many electrons? 10 electrons. ठीक है, 10 electrons को आप कैसे फिल करेंगे? फर्स्ट शेल में कितने डालेंगे? 2, comma. Second shell में how many are you left with? 10 minus 2 means 8. Can the second shell occupy 8 or not? Yes, it can. It can occupy 8 electrons. अगर आपके पास 11 होते, when you have 11 electrons, then you have to move on to the third shell. ये आपको यहाँ से नजर आ रहा है that now you have 3 digits written. 3 digits represent that this element is now from period number 3. How do we know? By looking at the electronic configuration that this particular element is from period number 3. Well, we know this because we have seen that in front of us we are seeing 3 digits. First में कितने आ जाएंगे? Now sodium has 11 electrons. The first one would have 2. Second में कितने आ जाएंगे? 8. Yeah, first में हो गया आपके पास 2. How many more are you left with? 11 minus 2 makes 9. Can your second shell fill 9 electrons? No, it can't. आपके second shell की जो capacity है, that is 8. You are left over with 9 electrons. So what can you do is you have to move on to the third shell. आपको third shell पे move on करना पड़ेगा. Now you can see that the first shell is complete with 2. The second shell is also complete with 8 electrons because the maximum capacity of the second shell was 8 electrons. And the third shell is having 1. ये आपके पास complete नहीं है. So sodium आपके पास 11 हो गया. But when we talk about neon, neon जो है, neon is from group number 8. How do I know the group number of neon? What are the number of electrons in the outermost shell? 8. तो group number क्या है? 8. If I ask you, what is the group number of boron? It would be 3. What is the group number of carbon? Group number 4. Group number 5. Group number 6. Group number 7. ये हम कैसे बताते हैं? By looking at the last digit of the electronic configuration or the valence number of electrons in the outermost shell. How can we determine the number of periods? Periods हम कैसे determine करते हैं? If I ask you that I have sulfur in front of me, अब सल्फर के मुझे नंबर ऑफ पीरियड्स भी बताएं एंड द नंबर ऑफ ग्रुप एज वेल. ये कौन सा पीरियड नंबर में है और कौन से ग्रुप नंबर में है? सो ऑब्वियसली टू फाइंड द पीरियड नंबर यू आर गोइंग टू काउंट दिस 1 2 3. टोटल नंबर ऑफ डिजिट्स कितने हैं आपके पास? 3 डिजिट्स हैं, which means 3 shells. So sulfur is in period number 3. Now what is the group number of sulfur? The group number of sulfur would be the valence number of electrons in the outermost shell. तो वो आपके पास यहाँ पे कितने हैं? 6. So sulfur is in group number 6 and period number 3. Same is the case अगर हम बात करें for example अब क्लोरीन की. Now chlorine का जो atomic number है that is 17, which means it has 17 electrons. तो वो हमने कैसे fill किया? First में आ गए 2. How many more are we left with? 15. नेक्स्ट में हम 8 फिल कर देते हैं. सेकंड इज आल्सो कंप्लीट बिकॉज सेकंड की जो मैक्सिमम कैपेसिटी थी दैट वाज 8. हाउ मेनी मोर आर वी लेफ्ट विद? 7 मोर इलेक्ट्रॉन्स. अब हमने 17 से 10 माइनस करना है, सो द रेस्ट ऑफ द 7 would be filled in the outermost shell. Outermost shell में है 7 electrons, which means that chlorine is in group number 7. Group number 7 को हम halogens भी कहते हैं. We also call group number 7 halogens. आर्गन की बात करें, आर्गन अगेन फॉर एग्जांपल नियॉन था, जैसे नियॉन भी नोबल गैस है, आर्गन इज आल्सो नोबल गैस. हाउ डू आई नो इट्स अ नोबल गैस? बाय लुकिंग एट द इलेक्ट्रॉनिक कॉन्फ़िगरेशन. आपका जो आउटर मोस्ट शेल है, व्हिच इज द थर्ड शेल, outermost shell कौन सा इसका? The third shell. And I know that the third shell has a maximum capacity of 8 electrons. और third shell में जब maximum 8 electrons आ सकते हैं, so in front of me the third shell is having complete number of electrons in the outermost shell. The outermost shell, which was the third shell, is totally complete. It doesn't have to lose, it doesn't have to gain. ये बिल्कुल complete है आपके पास. और ये इससे मुझे पता लग रहा है the 8 shows that it is in group number 8. या हम इसको ग्रुप नंबर 0 का भी नाम देते हैं बिकॉज दीज आर अनरिएक्टिव इनर्ट नोबल गैसेस. अगर हम बात करें पोटेशियम और कैल्शियम की, पोटेशियम और कैल्शियम किस ग्रुप में आते हैं? पोटेशियम किस ग्रुप में होगा? ग्रुप नंबर 1. कैल्शियम किस ग्रुप में है? ग्रुप नंबर 2. इन दोनों का पीरियड कौन सा है? दे बोथ आर इन पीरियड नंबर 4. हाउ डू आई नो दे आर इन पीरियड नंबर 4? बाय लुकिंग एट द नंबर ऑफ डिजिट्स. 1 2 3 4. कितने डिजिट्स हैं आपके पास? 4 डिजिट्स हैं, which means 4 number of shells. तो आपको ये पीरियड नंबर भी क्या हो जाएगा? योर पीरियड नंबर वुड बी 4. कैसे पता लगेगा? हमारे पास कैल्शियम है, ठीक है. अगर हम कैल्शियम की यहाँ पे ड्रॉ करें, लेट मी इरेज दिस नीचे वाला जो पार्ट था. ओके, now below here I am going to write the electronic configuration in red color. Do look at this. The number of electrons in calcium are 20. Now let's start filling the shells. First shell में कितने आ सकते हैं? 2. How many more are we left with? 18 more electrons. अच्छा, second shell में आते हैं, we will fill 8. How many more are we still left with? 10 more electrons. Third भी fill कर देते हैं. Third में maximum कितने आ सकते हैं? 8. As we looked at over here, first shell में आएंगे 2 electrons, second में आएंगे 8 electrons, third में आएंगे आपके पास 8 electrons. Now how are we going to fill calcium? Calcium के तो यहाँ भी 2 complete हो गए. Calcium ने 8 यहाँ भी कर दिया है और कैल्शियम ने 8 यहाँ भी कर दिया है. दिस मेक्स टोटल ऑफ 18. कैल्शियम के पास कितने हैं? कैल्शियम हैज 20 इलेक्ट्रॉन्स. द रेस्ट 2 आर गोइंग टू मूव ऑन टू द फोर्थ शेल. फोर्थ शेल जो होता है ना, फोर्थ शेल के अंदर आप रिमेनिंग 2 फिल कर देंगे. जो आपका फोर्थ शेल होगा उसके अंदर रिमेनिंग 2 इलेक्ट्रॉन्स हो जाएंगे बिकॉज फोर्थ शेल हैज द मैक्सिमम कैपेसिटी ऑफ 18 इलेक्ट्रॉन्स. फोर्थ शेल में आप 18 इलेक्ट्रॉन्स फिल कर सकते हैं. Now what is the final electronic configuration of calcium? 2 8 8 2. अब इस 2 8 8 2 से क्या क्या पता लग सकता है? Now by looking at the single electronic configuration in front of you जो कि है 2 8 8 2, what things can you determine by just looking at it? I can tell that the first shell has 2 electrons, the second shell has 8 electrons, the third shell has 8 electrons, and the fourth shell has 2 electrons. इसके अलावा what more else I can tell is that the period number of calcium is 4. Why? Because how many shells do I have? 1 2 3 4. 4 number of shells, which means that calcium is in period number 4. I can also tell the group number. Group number कैसे पता लगेगा? The outermost number of electrons. जो आपका outermost shell है. What is your outermost shell? The fourth shell is the outermost shell. ठीक है? In case of calcium, the fourth shell is the outermost valence shell. So valence electrons आपके पास कितने? 2, which means calcium is in period number 4 and group number 2. Moreover, I can also tell that the highest energy level shell जो आपके पास है, वो आपके पास कौन सा है? Fourth shell. The fourth shell would be having the highest energy, and the first shell would be having the lowest energy. These are all the things that you can just tell by looking at a simple electronic configuration of an element. Now, अगर आपको ये दी हो and they tell you to identify with what is this element, ये कौन सा element है, you are going to simply go at period number 4 and you're going to take group number 2. The answer would be calcium. This is the complete game about electronic configuration. All right, you can join from your laptop. Now we know that electronic configuration है, the electronic configuration can tell us a lot of things, such as the type of element, it can tell us the number of periods, it can tell us the number of group, group number क्या है, period number क्या है, number of shells क्या है, number of valence electrons क्या है, is that element a metal है या non-metal है, is that element a noble gas or it's not a noble gas, energy levels बता सकता है. Now, if we talk about electronic configurations and the periodic table, how are they both linked? Electronic configuration क्या है basically? इसको अगर हम define करें, the arrangements of electrons into shells for an atom. It is basically the arrangement of electrons, how the electrons are arranged into different number of shells. जैसे कि how many electrons are there in the first shell, how many electrons are there in the second shell, the third shell, and the fourth shell. हमने ये देख ही लिए, and we have already talked about that the first shell can occupy a total number of 2 electrons, the second shell can occupy a total number of 8 electrons, the third shell can occupy a number of 8 electrons, and the fourth shell can in total occupy the number of 18 electrons. For example, the electronic configuration of carbon. अब carbon क्या है? Carbon has an atomic number of 6 and a mass number of 12. Now, atomic number of 6 means that it has 6 protons. 6 protons meaning that it has 6 electrons. तो अगर मैं electrons को electronic configuration में complete करूंगा, what am I going to get? The first shell would have 2 electrons. 6 minus 2, ठीक है, 2 तो आपका complete हो गया para shell. 6 minus 2, how many more electrons am I left with? 4 electrons. तो बाकी 4 electrons मैं second shell में fill कर दूंगा, and this would be your electronic configuration. Now, by looking at the electronic configuration, can I tell the period number and the group number of carbon? Yes, I can. What is the period number of carbon? Period number of carbon आ जाएगा first shell, second shell. Total number of shells कितने हैं? 2. So carbon is in period number 2. Can I also tell the group number? Valence shell में कितने electrons हैं? 4 electrons are there in the valence shell, which means that carbon is in group number 4. This is how you can tell the period number and the group number by looking at the electronic configuration. Electronic configuration and the position in periodic table. आप periodic table के अंदर element की position भी बता सकते हैं. As I just told you that the period number and the group number is enough to identify the element that is present in the periodic table. The number of notations in the electronic configuration will show the number of shells of electrons the atom has, which showing the period. अब number of notations कितनी थी? First notation, second notation, total of 2 notations, which means कि इसका जो period number था वो क्या था? Period 2. तो ये number of notations हो या number of digits हो, they are going to let you know the number of period. The last notation, अब last notation कौन सी थी? This 4. The last notation is 4. That 4 is going to tell you the number of outer electrons, या इसको हम क्या एक term और देते थे? Valence electrons. We also call it valence electrons the atom has, which shows the group number. और आपका group number जो हो जाएगा वो होगा 4. For example, the electronic configuration of chlorine. Electronic configuration of chlorine कैसे होगी? ये आपके पास एक diagram में given है. We know that अब ये आपके पास पूरी electron configuration दी हुई है of chlorine. We can determine the last notation and we can also tell the number of notations. How many notations are there? 1, 2, 3. They are going to tell you the period number. इसका period number क्या है? 3. The last notation is 7. आपकी जो last notation है, which is in the outermost shell, which is the valence shell, आपका जो third shell है वो कौन सा है? अगर मैं कहूँ what is the valence shell? Valence shell आपके पास कौन सा है इधर? The third one. The third shell is your valence shell, the outermost shell. And the last notation is 7, which means that chlorine is in group number 7. और group number 7 को हम एक नाम देते हैं, which is halogens. ये आपके पास क्या होते हैं सारे? These are all known as halogens. अब halogens के अंदर आपके पास chlorine आता है, fluorine आता है, you have iodine and bromine. ये आपके पास सारे halogens होते हैं. ये सारे diatomic elements भी कहलाते हैं. When I told you in the first class, जैसे कि period 1 में आपके पास fluorine आ जाता है, period 2 के अंदर फिर हमने क्या बात कर ली थी? You have chlorine, the next is bromine, and then next comes iodine, और end में आपके पास astatine आ जाता है. This is the sequence of your group number 7 basically. Electronic configurations and the periodic table again. So period, the red numbers below the electronic configuration show the number of notations, which is 3, showing that chlorine atom has 3 shells of electrons. अब जो ये red numbers के अंदर हमने नीचे mention किया था, these are the number of notations. कि हमारे पास 3 notations है, which means that the element we are talking about is basically in period number 3. Group कैसे identify होगा? The last notation, which is 7, shows that a chlorine atom has 7 outer electrons matching group 7 of the periodic table. तो period number आपके पास identify हो जाएगा by looking at the number of notations और साथ ही साथ ग्रुप नंबर कैसे आइडेंटिफाई हो जाएगा बाय लुकिंग एट द लास्ट नोटेशन जो आपकी बिल्कुल लास्ट नोटेशन होगी कौन सी नोटेशन द लास्ट नोटेशन उसका जो भी नंबर होगा दैट वुड बी योर ग्रुप नंबर ऑफ दैट स्पेसिफिक एलिमेंट. So this is how we identified the position of chlorine in the periodic table. तो क्या निकला था chlorine was in period number 3 and group number 7. तो period 3 आपके पास कौन सा है? This is your period number 3. ये period number 3 था. And what is your group number? Group number था आपके पास 7. तो यहाँ से हमने identify कर लिया that yes, this is where the chlorine is found in the periodic table. तो आपने easily position भी बता दी of the particular element in the periodic table. And this is all for today. आज हमने discuss कर लिया about electronic configuration, that how you can tell the period number, the group number, the energy level, the number of shells, the number of valence electrons, and the position of the particular element in the periodic table. So we'll move on to the next topic in our next lecture, जिसके अंदर we'll be talking about classifying metals and non-metals and how can we tell them or differ them by looking at the periodic table.